Pamela Isley, aka Poison Ivy, has plenty of well-known classic storylines. Like for example... And let's not forget... Yeah, okay, there are no big classic Poison Ivy tales. I guess her most famous appearances would be in The Long Halloween and Hush, but those are only small supporting parts. She isn't the main villain in either of them. Of course, that doesn't mean there are no good Ivy tales that focus on her. There's in fact plenty of them. You can definitely say they're all overlooked. I've talked about many of them on this channel already, like for example the 1997 Poison Ivy graphic novel, her 1989 origin by Neil Gaiman, and that 1996 two-parter by Chuck Dixon with the Weed Whacker. But there's still good Ivy comics out there that deserve mention, and that is what this video is for. As usual, this is not a countdown. I will merely list the stories in chronological order. And without further ado, let's get to it. A Kiss of Death ×3, A Poison of the Heart. From World's Finest Comics 251 and 252, published in 1978. This two-part Wonder Woman story was written by Jerry Conway and penciled by Rick Estrada and Jack Abel. In the tale, Ivy poisons and kills 3 UN diplomats in New York. And considering that's Wonder Woman's turf and not Batman's, the Amazon is on the case. Eventually, we discovered that Ivy was hired by an African dictator to commit the murders. He wanted the diplomats dead as they were his enemies, and in return Ivy would be granted a rare kind of herb that only grew in his African country. With this special herb, Ivy was going to mind control Batman into becoming her obedient slave. You gotta remember that this was before Ivy actually had the power to do so herself. In this story, it is in fact established that her sole power is immunity to all toxins. And that's it. It's a good plot, and seeing Ivy go up against a super powerful Wonder Woman instead of Batman is really interesting. But what truly makes this comic so special is the fact it supplied us with Ivy's very first origin. And it's a good origin to boot. It's not the same origin as she will later have, although it is very similar. Here her name is actually Lillian Rose, not Pamela Isley, and the man who made her into Poison Ivy isn't Professor Jason Woodrue, but a fellow by the name of Mark Legrand. Legrand was Lillian's college botany professor who seduced the naive young woman. He then manipulated her into stealing a rare type of herb locked up at a museum, which he planned to sell to the highest bidder. After the deed was done, Legrand poisoned her to rid of any witnesses. But she didn't die. Instead, she gained her immunity towards toxins, because it's comics. Like I said, it's very similar to her modern origin, the only real difference being the Legrand character and Ivy's name. It makes you wonder why they even bothered to change her origin in the first place. It was perfectly fine this way. Ivy is portrayed as a pretty evil monster in the story. For example, she has a monstrous plant man as a henchman, who was at one point her lover, until she transformed him into that hideous thing. However, taking her tragic origin into consideration, she ends up being less despicable and more sad. We kind of understand why she is as wicked as she is, and in fact even pity her. A must-read for any Poison Ivy fan, as not only is it historically important, but also a great story. Jerry Conway definitely deserves more props for being the one who came up with the character's origin. Untitled from Shadow of the Bat Annual 3, published in 1995. This one was written by Alan Grant and penciled by Brian Apthorpe. Again, we've got a story that the writer forgot to name. Anyway, in 1995, all Batman annuals were dedicated to villain origin stories. There were 4 of them in total. 1 for Scarecrow, 1 for Riddler, 1 for Man-Bat, and this one for Poison Ivy. However, unlike the others, this one isn't really an origin. In the story, we meet an already fully formed Poison Ivy, and only get 2 flashback panels dedicated to her origin. What this story really is a retelling of her first encounter with Batman. Ivy is a new villainess in town who pulls off daring capers, robbing the rich with bizarre powers, like mind control pheromones and deadly poisons. Yeah, by now Ivy had been established as possessing a myriad of powers. Needless to say, she's unlike anything Batman has ever faced in the Gotham underworld. Not only is Ivy more powerful than his previous enemies, but he's not even sure whether he wants to book her or bang her. This was actually the first Poison Ivy comic I ever read, and I gotta say, initially I was actually really disappointed with it. I think it's because I was expecting a detailed account of her origin, how Pam became Ivy. Now that I know what it really is, I accept it for what it is. And over the years I've grown to like it considerably. Who needs another origin anyway? Ivy's first crime spree is in of itself an interesting subject that deserved to be explored. Batman's response to this unusual kind of threat is after all something else, and seeing Ivy grow as a criminal is a lot of fun. For instance, for her first job she uses goons, but they end up betraying her. So for the remainder of her criminal career she decides to only use mind-controlled help. So now you know why Ivy always does that, instead of hiring people like the Joker or Two-Face does. Now, I've mentioned in the past that I can take my Poison Ivy either pure evil or sympathetic. Both work in my opinion. In this one, she definitely leans more towards pure evil. She is a pretty wicked femme fatale who cares very little for other people. She also has an issue with men, because it was men who used and abused her in the past. She actually has a sort of fixation on men. She hates them, but at the same time has a strong secret desire to find a perfect man, whatever that is. When she encounters Batman, he becomes the object of this fixation. Pretty fascinating stuff, and truly an Ivy who's ripe for psychological analysis. An underrated gem that shouldn't be judged unfairly simply because of people's misconceptions of what they thought it was. Reap What You Sow, from Catwoman 57, published in 1998. The story was written by Devin Grayson and penciled by Jim Ballant. It takes place during Cataclysm, the Batman arc that saw Gotham City hit by a massive earthquake, which would eventually lead into the year-long arc No Man's Land. With Gotham City in ruins, Catwoman, conflicted antihero that she is, takes a break from her usual thieving and stays busy stopping thieves instead, looters, to prevent further chaos. She then runs into Poison Ivy, who's plotting some kind of scheme. At first, Selina isn't quite sure whether she's up for a fight with this powerful supervillainess, but eventually realizes she has no choice when Ivy's scheme turns out to be something truly sinister. Seeing the devastating earthquake as a new chance for Gotham, Ivy has decided to rebuild the city as something better, a tropical paradise overgrown with mutated plants. To accomplish this, she has created a new super fertilizer that she will dump in the Gotham reservoir. The remaining ruins of Gotham will be utterly obliterated in the process, and most citizens will die. Pretty standard Poison Ivy fare actually, but what makes this comic special are two things. One, it's 90s Jim Ballant Catwoman. Seeing this particular version of Selina go up against Ivy is a real treat, and the only time it actually happened, so it's a rarity too. This is actually one of the earliest encounters between the two characters, and they do seem to be only vaguely familiar with each other. In retrospect, that's kinda funny, as a decade later the two would be roommates in the Gotham City Sirens series. The second reason this comic is worth your attention is the portrayal of Ivy. Sure, her scheme is by the numbers, but she herself is written really well. You see, Ivy doesn't really think she's doing anything bad. In fact, she thinks she's a hero. This new world she'll create will be a paradise after all. Much better than modern urban Gotham. And she actually believes that everyone will be grateful for her actions, even the people who will die. In her mind, they will all be more than happy to sacrifice themselves for the greater good. Truly a completely deluded Ivy, and the crazier Ivy is, the more I like her. The end of this comic really demonstrates just how insane this Ivy is. I won't spoil what happens of course, but I will say the story is worth a read simply for that ending. Cast Shadows, from Batman and Poison Ivy, Cast Shadows, a one-shot graphic novel published in 2004. It was written by Ann Nocenti with the art done by John Van Fleet. In the story, Ivy has essentially reformed in Arkham and is now using her special plant skills for the betterment of mankind. Under the supervision of her Arkham doctor, Ivy has been able to develop miraculous new species of plant life, like a fungus that can create natural light, and a super strong vine that could potentially replace steel cable. However, her experiments are cut short when Dan Trimble, the supposedly richest man in Gotham, erects a new giant skyscraper. A skyscraper so massive it blocks out the sun in Ivy's Arkham cell. The sun she so desperately needs for both herself and her plants. Needless to say, she goes a little bananas over it, and begins to plot a revenge scheme on Trimble. As far as I know, this graphic novel just kinda came and went when it was published, without any fanfare or attention whatsoever. A real shame, as it is pretty damn great. In fact, it was my runner-up back when I did my top 5 best Ivy stories video. It offers us a pretty complex look at the character. She's very sympathetic, really less of a villain and more just misunderstood. It also explores her self-identity and her complicated relationship with Batman. They sort of kind of like each other, yet sort of kind of don't. Like I said, it's complicated. Another thing of note about this story is that it's one of few to actually remember that Ivy is supposed to be a scientist. So many stories focus on her seductive femme fatale side, or her delusional crazy side. And while there's nothing wrong with that, as I love my crazy femme fatale Ivy, it is nice to finally get something that focuses on her nerdy side. It's with her scientific genius that she's able to create these wondrous plants. Of course, I have to mention the art. It looks amazing, especially in certain parts. I'm not even sure how it was made. It might have been painted, but I'm not quite sure. Either way, it suits this graphic novel perfectly. Graphic novels are supposed to stand out among regular comic books after all. And you know immediately when you look at this that it ain't no ordinary dime-a-dozen Batman issue. And finally, for overlooked Poison Ivy stories, we've got Human Nature, published between issues 61 to 65 of Batman Gotham Knights in 2005. This 5-parter was written by A.J. Lieberman and penciled by Al Barrionvuo. Yeah, I challenge you to pronounce his name. Anyway, so this story follows up on the events of No Man's Land, when Ivy was holed up in Robinson Park, which she turned into a wild jungle. She also took in a bunch of orphans, giving them shelter and food when no one else could or would. In this story, it's revealed that now, 2 years later in continuity, the orphans are all dying from a strange sickness. Turns out they got the sickness from Ivy, from spending so much time with her in the park. Ivy is far more toxic than she could ever have imagined, and it's now apparent that she can't even be near humans for a prolonged period of time without killing them. Feeling incredibly guilty, she sets out to find the remaining living orphans and discover a way to help them. She also seeks out Dr. Jason Woodrue, the man who made her what she is, in hopes of finding a way to cure herself, revert back to what she used to be, a normal human being. This story features by far the most sympathetic Ivy of all the stories in this video, and maybe all of comics. She's not really a villain whatsoever. All her goals in this story are entirely noble and completely selfless. It also explores a very unusual subject, namely Ivy wanting to become human again. We rarely ever see this, as most of the time she seems completely content with her condition. We get great bits with Ivy and Bruce Wayne for once too, not Ivy and Batman. Besides seeking out Jason, she also enlists the aid of Bruce in helping to find a cure for her. Bruce thus gets to know Pam better than he's ever done before, and just like we do, he gets to see a completely different side of her. Now, I'm not going to say that this comic is perfect though, because it isn't. There are some flaws in the writing department, especially in the final act. However, I definitely say it's still worth your time if you're a big Poison Ivy fan, simply because of the unusual and fascinating subject matters it explores. So there you have it, 5 overlooked Poison Ivy tales. I think that's it for Ivy in this series. I will most likely not be making a volume 2 for her, simply because I don't think I can think of 5 additional Ivy comics that are good enough. Next up in the series will probably be the Dark Knight himself. This might be the first time I make a video that's all about Batman, so that's gonna be interesting. Anyway, as always, remember, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.